The great hall of the Galactic Council buzzed with nervous energy as Ambassador Thren stepped forward to address the assembled representatives. His blue, translucent skin seemed to glow under the chamber's lights, and his four arms moved gracefully as he spoke. The other species in the hall watched him with a mixture of sympathy and fear, knowing what his presence meant. "Honorable council members," Thren began, his voice carrying across the massive chamber, "I come before you today not as a diplomat, but as a desperate being whose people face extinction." His words hung in the air like a death sentence. The Valerians were known throughout the galaxy as peaceful beings who had never harmed another species in their 1,000-year history of space travel. Counselor Brix, a large reptilian creature with scales that shifted from green to gray when he was agitated, leaned forward in his seat. "Ambassador Thren, we are aware of your situation with the Korthic Empire. However, our forces are already stretched thin across 17 different conflicts. We simply cannot spare the resources needed to challenge such a massive fleet. Friends." Four arms trembled slightly as he activated a holographic display that showed his homeworld of Valorous. The beautiful crystalline cities that had once gleamed like jewels against the planet's purple sky were now smoking ruins. Bodies of his people lay scattered in the streets, and massive Korthic war machines moved through the destruction like mechanical demons. 3 months ago, the Korthics arrived without warning, Thren continued, his voice growing stronger despite his obvious pain. They did not seek territory or resources. They came to destroy everything my people had built over millennia. Our technology, our art, our very existence means nothing to them. They are not conquerors seeking to rule us. They are exterminators who want us gone. The chamber fell silent as the hologram showed Korthic soldiers dragging Valerian civilians from their homes. The sight was disturbing even to species that had seen countless wars. The Korthics were methodical in their cruelty, taking time to terrorize their victims before ending their lives. A tall figure in the back of the chamber stood up slowly. Captain Torres of Earth's military had been quietly observing the proceedings, her steel-gray eyes taking in every detail of the presentation. Her weathered face showed no emotion as she studied the images of destruction, but those who knew humans could see the dangerous stillness that had settled over her. "Ambassador Thren," Torres said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "how many ships does the Korthic fleet have surrounding your world?" Thren's primary eyes focused on the human representative. "Intelligence reports suggest over 3,000 vessels, Captain Torres. Their ground forces number approximately 50 million soldiers. They have effectively sealed off all escape routes from Valorous." Murmurs rippled through the chamber as the other species absorbed these numbers. The Korthic Empire had committed nearly a quarter of their entire military to this single operation. It was unprecedented in galactic history. "What makes your world so valuable to them?" Torres asked, stepping closer to the holographic display. Her movements were controlled and precise. Like a predator studying its prey, Thren's secondary arms gestured toward a new section of the hologram. Valorous houses the Central Archive, the last complete record of pre-war galactic history. It contains the cultural memories of over 600 extinct species, scientific discoveries from civilizations that vanished eons ago, and historical records that date back nearly 1,000,000 years. If the Korthics destroy it, entire chapters of galactic history will be lost forever. The weight of this revelation settled over the chamber like a shroud. The Central Archive was more than just a library. It was the collective memory of the galaxy itself, containing knowledge that could never be replaced. Counselor, Brix's scales shifted to a deep gray as he processed this information. "Why didn't you relocate the archive when you first detected the Korthic fleet?" "We tried," Thren replied, his voice breaking slightly. "The archive is not just stored data. It is a living system that has grown over thousands of years. Moving. It would be like trying to transplant a mountain. The process would take decades, and we had only days before the siege began." Torres studied the tactical display that showed the Korthic fleet positions. Her mind was already working through possibilities. calculating odds and considering options that would horrify most civilized species. The other representatives saw an impossible situation. Torres saw a puzzle waiting to be solved. "Have you attempted negotiation with the Cortex?" Torres asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. War Master Grok responded to our diplomatic overtures by broadcasting the executions of our negotiation team across all communication frequencies, Thren said, his voice hollow with remembered horror. He made it clear that the only acceptable outcome is the complete annihilation of my species and the destruction of everything we have built. The chamber erupted in angry voices as representatives from various species condemned the Corthic actions. However, their outrage was meaningless without the military power to back it up. The Galactic Council's combined forces could not match the Corthic Empire's military might, and everyone in the chamber knew it. Torres raised her hand for silence, and remarkably the chamber grew quiet. There was something about the human representative that commanded respect, even from species that had never encountered Earth's military forces directly. "Ambassador Thren," Torres said slowly, "how long can your people hold out against the current assault?" Thren's translucent skin seemed to grow paler as he consulted the data streaming from his homeworld. "Our defensive systems are failing. The Corthics are not rushing their attack because they enjoy watching us suffer. Military analysts estimate we have perhaps 72 hours before our last city falls." The finality of this statement seemed to drain the energy from the chamber. 72 hours to save not just an entire species, but the collective memory of galactic civilization itself. It was an impossible deadline that no military force in the galaxy could meet. Torres stood in the silence, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her words were simple and direct. "Earth will respond to your request for assistance, Ambassador Thren." The chamber exploded into shocked voices as representatives from dozens of species tried to process what they had just heard. The humans were known throughout the galaxy as the species that had spent thousands of years fighting themselves before reaching the stars. Their reputation for warfare was legendary, but even they could not face the entire Corthic fleet alone. "Counselor." Brix's scales shifted rapidly between colors as he stood to address Torres. "Captain, with all due respect to your species' military capabilities, the Corthacs have committed 3,000 ships and 50 million soldiers to this operation. What could Earth possibly send that would make a difference against such overwhelming numbers?" Torres turned to face the reptilian counselor, and for a moment her controlled facade slipped to reveal something far more dangerous underneath. When she smiled, it was the kind of expression that made prey animals run for cover. "Counselor Brix," Torres said, her voice carrying a quiet confidence that somehow made her words more terrifying than if she had shouted them. "You're thinking like a civilized being. The Corthacs are expecting to face another civilized military force that follows the accepted rules of warfare. They're not prepared for what we're going to send them." The chamber fell silent again as the implications of Torres' words sank in. The other species had heard stories about humanity's history, about the countless wars they had fought against themselves before achieving unity. They had heard whispers about the humans' capacity for violence and their ability to find solutions. That other species couldn't even imagine as the council session ended. And the representatives began to file out. Counselor Brix approached Torres privately. His scales had settled into a nervous pattern of shifting grays and browns. "Captain Torres," he said quietly, "I've studied your species' military history. I know about your wars, your strategies, your weapons. But the Corthics are not human. They don't think like you do. They don't fear death the way other species do. What makes you think you can succeed where everyone else has failed?" Torres looked at the tactical display one more time, her mind already working through the details of what would need to happen in the next few hours. When she turned back to Brix, her smile was even more unsettling than before. "Counselor," she said, "we're not sending an army to fight the Corthics. We're not sending ships or weapons or anything they would expect. We're sending something far more dangerous than any military force in the galaxy." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle between them. We're sending humans who have nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Deep beneath the Swiss Alps, in a facility that existed in no official records, General Hayes sat at the head of a table that had seen more classified discussions than any other surface on Earth. The room was carved from solid rock and lined with materials that could block any known form of surveillance. The 5 people gathered around the table represented the most dangerous aspects of human military planning. Dr. Morgan adjusted her glasses as she reviewed the psychological profiles spread across the holographic display. Her specialty was understanding the human mind in its most extreme states, and her work had helped identify individuals who thrived in situations that would break ordinary people. She had spent decades studying what made some humans capable of unthinkable acts while others crumbled under the slightest pressure. The Korthic Empire has perfected psychological warfare, she explained to the assembled group. They break civilizations by destroying their will to fight before the first shot is fired. They study their enemies' fears and use them as weapons. Traditional military responses play right into their hands because they expect their opponents to act rationally. Commander Blake leaned back in his chair, his missing left arm a constant reminder of the Proxima incident 3 years earlier. He had lost a limb while defusing a bomb that would have killed 300 civilians, and his calm acceptance of the injury had become legendary among special operations personnel. His experience with unconventional warfare made him the perfect person to select candidates for impossible missions. So we need people who don't respond to fear the way normal humans do, Blake said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen too much combat. We need individuals who see impossible odds as interesting challenges rather than death sentences. Lieutenant Kane, the youngest person in the room, pulled up the first set of personnel files. His job was to review the psychological evaluations and military records of Earth's most unusual soldiers. These were not criminals or psychopaths, but people who had proven themselves capable of functioning in situations that would traumatize ordinary individuals. The first candidate is Rex Vance, Kane announced as a holographic image appeared above the table. The man looked ordinary enough with brown hair and average build, but his eyes held an intensity that suggested hidden depths. Former war correspondent who requested assignment to the most dangerous conflict zones. He walked into active battle zones not because he had to, but because he wanted to understand what combat really meant. General Hayes studied the file with interest. Vance had covered 17 major conflicts in his career, always placing himself in the most dangerous positions possible. His articles had won awards not just for their accuracy, but for their ability to capture the psychological reality of warfare from the perspective of someone who genuinely enjoyed being in mortal danger. What makes him special? Hayes asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. He doesn't experience fear the way most people do, Dr. Morgan explained. In psychological testing, situations that would trigger panic responses in 99% of the population actually calm him down. He performs better under pressure than he does in safe environments. The next file belonged to Nina Cross, a woman whose survival record read like something from a nightmare. The image showed someone with short black hair and scars on her hands that spoke of numerous close calls with death. Her expression was calm, but there was something predatory in the way she studied her surroundings. Arctic survival specialist, Kane continued. She once spent 43 days alone in the Antarctic after her research station was destroyed by a storm. When rescue teams finally found her, she had not only survived, but had improved the station's emergency systems. The medical report noted that she had amputated her own frostbitten fingers using improvised tools. Commander Blake nodded approvingly. How did she handle the psychological evaluation? She described the experience as educational, Dr. Morgan replied. She said it taught her interesting things about human limitations and how to overcome them. She's requested assignment to increasingly dangerous survival situations ever since. The third candidate was Marcus Hunt, whose file contained enough explosive incidents to level a small city. The hologram showed a man with steady hands and eyes that seemed to see through everything around him. His personnel record indicated A disturbing pattern of seeking out the most dangerous bomb disposal assignments available. Explosives expert with over 300 successful diffusions, Kane explained. He's dealt with everything from terrorist devices to alien technology. Recovered from crashed ships. His psychological profile indicates that he finds the process of working with unstable explosives to be relaxing rather than stressful. General Hayes frowned as he reviewed the specific incidents. It says here that he volunteered for the Titan Station cleanup after the reactor explosion. That was essentially a suicide mission. He completed the job in half the estimated time, Blake added. The report noted that he seemed disappointed when it was over. He's been requesting similar assignments ever since. The fourth file belonged to Zoe Walsh, whose image showed a woman with calloused hands and eyes that missed nothing. Her background was in deep space mining, but her record indicated a talent for combat that had surprised even her instructors. Deep space mining specialist, who spent 2 years working alone on asteroid installations, Kane explained. She was attacked by pirates during a routine supply run and fought them off for 6 hours. Using improvised weapons and mining equipment? The security footage showed her adapting her tactics in real time and actually enjoying the challenge. Dr. Morgan highlighted several sections of Walsh's psychological evaluation. She demonstrates what we call predatory patience. She can wait for days or weeks for the right opportunity to act, and when she does move, her responses are devastatingly effective. She also shows no significant stress responses to violence or danger. The fifth and final candidate was Jake Rivers, whose file contained incidents that would have ended most military careers. The hologram showed a man with dark hair and an expression that suggested he was constantly calculating odds and possibilities. Former military intelligence specialist who infiltrated enemy organizations 17 times, Kane explained. He has an unusual talent for understanding how different cultures think and using that knowledge to manipulate situations. His psychological profile indicates that he finds complex social manipulation to be intellectually stimulating. General Hayes closed the files and looked around the table. These 5 individuals represent the most dangerous aspects of human nature channeled into productive directions. They don't just survive impossible situations, they thrive in them. But the question remains, can we trust them? Commander Blake's expression grew serious. Sir, I've worked with unconventional assets before. The key is understanding what motivates them. These aren't people who respond to traditional military discipline or patriotic appeals. They're driven by the challenge itself. And if they decide, the challenge includes turning on us? Lieutenant Kane asked, voicing the concern that everyone was thinking. Dr. Morgan leaned forward. Her fingers steepled as she considered the question. That's actually what makes them perfect for this mission. They're not driven by ideology or politics. They're driven by the puzzle of seemingly impossible situations. The Korthic Empire represents the ultimate challenge, an enemy that has never been defeated using tactics that have broken every other species that faced them. General Hayes stood and walked to the window that looked out over the underground facility. Hundreds of technicians and specialists were already working on the logistics of getting these 5 individuals to Velaris in time to make a difference. The margin for error was essentially 0. The Galactic Council expects us to fail, he said quietly. They think we're sending these people to their deaths in a gesture of symbolic support. They don't understand that we're not trying to fight. The Korthics conventionally. What exactly are we trying to do? Kane asked. Hayes turned back to the group, his expression grim. We're going to teach the Korthics what it means to fight humans. Not human armies or human technology, but human nature itself. These 5 people represent everything that made our species survive when we should have destroyed ourselves. The room fell silent as the implications of the mission became clear. They were not sending soldiers to fight a war. They were sending predators to hunt prey that had never been hunted before. Dr. Morgan gathered her files and stood to leave. General, there's one more thing the Council should understand about these individuals. They're not heroes in any traditional sense. They're people who have found ways to transform their darkest impulses into tools for survival. When they reach Valorous, they won't try to save the Valerians out of compassion or duty. Then why will they do it? Hayes asked. Because, Dr. Morgan replied, the Korthax represent everything these people have spent their lives learning to destroy. They'll save Valorous because it's the most interesting thing they've ever been asked to do. As the meeting ended and the participants filed out to begin their preparations, Lieutenant Kane lingered behind. Sir, do you really think 5 people can make a difference against 3,000 ships and 50 million soldiers? General Hayes looked at the profiles one more time, studying the faces of Earth's most dangerous individuals. Lieutenant, the Korthax have spent centuries perfecting the art of breaking civilizations. They understand how to destroy hope, how to shatter morale, how to turn entire species against themselves. But they've never faced humans who enjoy being afraid, who find comfort in chaos, and who see impossible odds as personal invitations. He closed the files and headed toward the door. They're about to learn why we call them the most dangerous humans on Earth. Asterisk, 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 the Korthic siege fleet hung in space around Valorous like a mechanical storm cloud, its 3,000 ships arranged in perfect formation around the dying planet. War Master Grok stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the final phase of the bombardment with satisfaction. The crystalline cities that had once made Valorous famous throughout the galaxy were now smoking ruins, and his ground forces were methodically eliminating the last pockets of resistance. Grok was a massive creature, standing nearly 8 feet tall with scales that had been enhanced with cybernetic implants. His left arm had been replaced with a mechanical appendage that could crush steel, and his eyes had been surgically modified to process multiple spectrums of light simultaneously. He had conquered 47 worlds in his career and had never experienced defeat. Sir, his communication officer reported, we're detecting a small transport vessel approaching the planet. It appears to be requesting permission to land. Grok's enhanced eyes focused on the tactical display. The ship was tiny compared to his massive fleet, barely large enough to carry a dozen passengers. It bore the identification markings of the Galactic Council, suggesting it was probably carrying diplomats or observers. Let it pass, Grok ordered dismissively. Whatever pathetic gesture the Council thinks they're making, it won't change the outcome. The Valerians will be extinct within 6 hours. The transport ship descended through the atmosphere without incident, its small size and unremarkable appearance making it invisible to the Korthic sensors that were focused on detecting military threats. Inside the cramped passenger compartment, 5 humans sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts as they prepared for what lay ahead. Rex Vance studied the tactical reports from the planet's surface with the same intensity he had once brought to war zones across the galaxy. His mind was already working through the psychological profile of the Korthic forces, identifying weaknesses and opportunities that others would miss. The sight of massive destruction didn't disturb him. Instead, it told him everything he needed to know about how his enemies thought. Nina Cross examined the environmental data from Valorous, noting the temperature patterns, atmospheric composition, and terrain features that would affect their mission. Her experience surviving in hostile environments had taught her to see opportunities where others saw only obstacles. The ruined cities would provide excellent cover for the kind of asymmetric warfare she specialized in. Marcus Hunt reviewed the technical specifications of Korthic weapons and equipment with professional interest. His expertise with explosives had given him an intuitive understanding of how alien technology worked, and he was already developing plans for turning the enemy's own weapons against them. The Korthic preference for overwhelming firepower would become a liability in the right hands. Zoe Walsh sat perfectly still, her mind focused on the hunting strategies she would need for the mission ahead. Her experience tracking targets through asteroid fields and space stations had taught her patience and precision. The Korthic soldiers would be formidable opponents, but they had never faced a predator who understood their psychology better than they did. Jake Rivers processed intelligence reports about Korthac command structure and cultural patterns. His talent for understanding alien psychology would be crucial for manipulating their responses and turning their own tactics against them. The Korthic's rigid military hierarchy would become a weakness. Once he understood how to exploit it, the transport touched down in the ruins of Valeris's capital city, where the few surviving Valerian defenders had established a temporary command center in the underground tunnels. Ambassador Thren was waiting for them, his translucent skin now dulled with exhaustion and despair. "I must thank you for coming," Thren said as the humans disembarked, "but I fear there is little hope left. The Korthax have destroyed 90% of our defenses, and their ground forces are advancing toward the central archive. We have perhaps 4 hours before they reach the final vault." Rex Vance looked around the devastated city with calm interest, noting the patterns of destruction and the tactical positions the Korthax had chosen. "Ambassador, we're not here to save your defenses. We're here to change the nature of the conflict entirely." The surviving Valerian military commander, a 4-armed officer named Keth, studied the 5 humans with confusion. "With respect, these are only 5 individuals. How can so few make a difference against 50 million soldiers?" Minya Cross smiled, and the expression was somehow more unsettling than reassuring. "Commander, your people have been fighting this war like civilized beings. You've been following the rules of engagement, trying to minimize casualties, attempting to preserve infrastructure. That's why you're losing." Marcus Hunt knelt beside a damaged Korthic weapon that had been recovered from the battlefield. His hands moved over the device with practiced skill, understanding its construction and limitations within minutes. These weapons are designed for maximum psychological impact rather than tactical efficiency. They're built to terrify rather than to kill cleanly. Zoe Walsh moved through the ruins like a ghost, her eyes tracking movement patterns and identifying potential hiding places. Her predatory instincts were already cataloging the strengths and weaknesses of the urban battlefield. The Korthax are used to enemies who fight them directly. They're not prepared for opponents who disappear into the shadows. Jake Rivers studied the Korthic communication intercepts, his mind working through the cultural and psychological implications of their tactics. They're following a pattern that has worked for them on 47 previous worlds. They believe they understand how all other species will respond to their psychological warfare. Rex Vance gathered his team around a holographic map of the city. "Here's what we're going to do. The Korthax expect resistance to collapse once they break the main defensive lines. They're not prepared for the kind of warfare that humans develop during our species' most desperate conflicts." Ambassador Thren watched the humans with growing unease. There was something about their casual attitude toward the overwhelming odds that disturbed him deeply. "What exactly are you planning to do?" "We're going to teach the Korthax what it means to fight humans," Vance replied. "Not human armies or human technology, but human nature itself. We're going to show them that their greatest strength can become their greatest weakness." The team split up to begin their preparations. Nina Cross disappeared into the tunnel system, using her survival skills to identify routes that would allow movement through enemy territory without detection. Her knowledge of harsh environments translated perfectly to urban warfare in a devastated city, Marcus. Hunt began studying the Korthic equipment more carefully, not to understand how to defend against it, but to learn how to use it more effectively than its creators had intended. His experience with explosive devices had taught him that every weapon was also a potential trap waiting to be triggered. Zoe Walsh started tracking individual Korthic soldiers, learning their patrol patterns and behavioral quirks. Her hunting instincts allowed her to predict where they would be and how they would react to different stimuli. She was building a psychological map of the enemy that would allow her to move among them like a predator among prey. Jake Rivers infiltrated the Korthic communication network, using his understanding of alien psychology to plant seeds of doubt and confusion. His talent for manipulation was already beginning to work on the rigid command structure that held the Korthic forces together. Rex Vance coordinated the overall strategy, using his experience with psychological warfare to identify the pressure points that would cause maximum disruption to enemy morale. He understood that the Korthac's greatest strength was their confidence in their own invincibility. As night fell over the ruined city, the Korthic forces settled into their standard siege pattern. War Master Grok reviewed the tactical reports from his ground commanders, noting the steady progress toward the central archive. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Then the first anomaly occurred. A supply convoy reported equipment failures that seemed to cascade through their entire column. Weapons malfunctioned, communication systems failed, and vehicles broke down in ways that suggested sabotage, but left no evidence of tampering. The second incident involved a patrol that simply vanished. 12 Korthik soldiers on a routine reconnaissance mission stopped responding to radio calls. When a search team found them, they were unconscious and suffering from what appeared to be severe psychological trauma. The third problem was more subtle. Officers throughout the Korthik command structure began reporting strange dreams and disturbing thoughts. Their sleep cycles were disrupted, and their decision-making abilities seemed to be compromised by anxiety and paranoia. War Master Grok dismissed these incidents as stress-related problems common in extended siege operations. His forces had been in position for 3 months, and some equipment failures were to be expected. The psychological issues were probably caused by the alien environment and would resolve themselves once the mission was complete. But the incidents continued to escalate. Supply lines began failing in cascading patterns that suggested coordination but left no evidence of enemy action. Communication networks experienced interference that seemed to target specific frequencies at crucial moments. Individual soldiers began reporting encounters with shadows that moved independently of their sources. By dawn, War Master Grok realized that something fundamental had changed about the nature of the conflict. His forces were still vastly superior in numbers and firepower, but they were no longer fighting the same enemy. The Valerians had been replaced by something that his tactical doctrine had never anticipated. Standing on his command deck, watching his perfectly organized siege operation begin to dissolve into chaos, Grok spoke to his communication officer. "Send the message to all ground commanders. I want to know what we're really fighting down there." The response came back within minutes, and for the first time in his career, War Master Grok felt something he had never experienced before: fear. The message was simple but terrifying. "Sir, we're not fighting Valerians anymore. We're fighting humans, and they're not fighting the way anything else does." As the second day of human involvement began, the Korthik Empire's most successful military commander realized that he was facing an enemy that operated by completely different rules. The humans had turned his own psychological warfare tactics against him, and his forces were beginning to crumble from within. The most dangerous humans on Earth had arrived, and they were just getting started. War Master Grok stood before the holographic display showing his forces' positions around Velarus, but the neat tactical formations that had dominated the planet for months were now marked with disturbing symbols. Equipment failures, communication blackouts, and missing patrols created gaps in his lines that seemed to grow larger with each passing hour. Sub-Commander Threx approached the command platform with obvious reluctance. The younger officer had served under Grok for 5 years and had never seen his commander show signs of uncertainty. Now the War Master's enhanced eyes constantly scanned the displays, searching for an enemy that seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. "Sir," Threx reported, "the 3rd Assault Division has lost contact with 6 more patrols." The last transmission indicated they were investigating unusual energy readings near the old industrial district. Grok's mechanical hand clenched, crushing the metal railing as he processed this information. "Define unusual energy readings." The sensors detected what appeared to be Korthik weapon signatures, but when reinforcements arrived, they found our own equipment had been modified and rigged to explode. The blast patterns suggest our weapons were used against us, but the modifications required technical knowledge that the Valerians don't possess. On the planet's surface, Marcus Hunt crouched in the ruins of a factory complex, his hands working with steady precision as he completed modifications to another cache of Korthik explosives. His expertise with volatile materials had taught him to see weapons not as tools of destruction, but as puzzles waiting to be solved in new ways. The Korthik arsenal was impressive in its raw power, but it was also predictable. Their designers had prioritized psychological impact over tactical flexibility, creating weapons that were devastating but rigid in their applications. Marcus was teaching them that flexibility was more dangerous than raw firepower. He finished his work and activated a timer that would detonate the charges when the next Korthik patrol arrived. The explosion would look like an equipment malfunction, but the cascade of secondary explosions would take out an entire city block. More importantly, it would reinforce the growing paranoia that was spreading through the Korthik ranks. 3 kilometers away, Nina Cross moved through the underground tunnel system like a ghost, her survival instincts allowing her to navigate the maze of collapsed passages and debris. Her experience in hostile environments had taught her to see the city's destruction as a new ecosystem, complete with predators, prey, and opportunities for those who understood the rules. She paused at an intersection where she could hear Korthik voices above. Her enhanced hearing, developed during years of Arctic survival, allowed her to track the exact positions of the patrol members. 4 soldiers moving in standard formation, following patterns that had been effective on dozens of other worlds. Nina smiled as she activated a device that Marcus had prepared for her. The small gadget would interfere with Korthik communication equipment, but only in subtle ways. Voices would become distorted, orders would be garbled, and the psychological pressure of being unable to communicate effectively would build over time. She placed the device and moved on, leaving no trace of her presence. The Korthaks would eventually find the source of their communication problems, but by then, she would have planted a dozen more devices throughout their operational area. Zoe Walsh observed the patrol from a concealed position in the ruins of a residential tower. Her predatory instincts had identified the patrol leader as a prime target, someone whose removal would create maximum disruption to local command structure. She had been tracking this particular officer for 18 hours. Learning his routines and psychological patterns, the Korthak moved with the confidence of a species that had never been hunted. Their formation was designed to intimidate rather than to provide mutual protection. They expected their enemies to flee or surrender, not to study them with the patience of an apex predator. Zoe waited until the patrol was in exactly the right position, then activated a series of traps that Marcus had prepared throughout the district. The explosions were carefully timed to create confusion rather than immediate casualties. In the chaos that followed, she moved like lightning, eliminating the patrol leader with surgical precision before disappearing back into the ruins. The remaining soldiers never saw what had killed their commander. They found themselves alone in a hostile environment, their communications disrupted, their leader dead, and their confidence shattered. The report they eventually sent back to headquarters spoke of shadows that moved independently and weapons that fired themselves. Jake Rivers sat in an abandoned communication center, his fingers dancing across alien keyboards as he infiltrated the Korthik command network. His talent for understanding alien psychology had allowed him to predict how the Korthiks would respond to different types of information, and he was feeding their own paranoia back to them through their own systems. He had identified the key officers in the Korthak hierarchy and was systematically undermining their confidence in each other. False reports of equipment failures, doctored communication logs, and subtly altered intelligence reports were creating a web of suspicion that was spreading through the command structure like a virus. The Korthik's rigid military culture made them vulnerable to this kind of psychological manipulation. They were trained to follow orders without question, but they were also trained to report problems up the chain of command. Jake was using both tendencies against them, creating a feedback loop of paranoia and mistrust. Rex Vance coordinated the overall strategy from a hidden position in the central archive itself. His understanding of psychological warfare had identified the Korthak's greatest weakness, their complete confidence in their own invincibility. They had never faced an enemy that could turn their own tactics against them. He monitored the reports coming in from his team and from the increasingly frantic Korthik communications. The enemy was beginning to understand that something fundamental had changed about the nature of their mission, but they didn't know how to respond to an enemy that operated by completely different rules. War Master Grok received the latest casualty reports with growing alarm. His forces were not being destroyed in direct combat. Instead, They were being systematically degraded through equipment failures, communication breakdowns, and the psychological pressure of fighting an enemy they couldn't see or understand. "Sir," Subcommander Threx reported, "the field commanders are requesting permission to withdraw to more defensible positions. They're reporting that their soldiers are becoming increasingly unreliable." Grok's enhanced eyes blazed with frustration. "Unreliable how?" "They're experiencing what the medical staff describes as combat fatigue, but they haven't been in any major battles. Equipment that has always worked perfectly is failing at critical moments. Soldiers who have never shown signs of fear are requesting reassignment." The War Master studied the tactical display, trying to understand how 5 humans could have such a devastating effect on his perfectly organized military machine. His forces still outnumbered the enemy by millions to 1, but numbers meant nothing if his soldiers couldn't function effectively. "How many casualties have we taken?" he asked. "Direct combat deaths are minimal," Threx replied. "But we've lost over 3,000 soldiers to what can only be described as psychological breakdown. They're physically unharmed, but they're no longer capable of performing their duties." The implications of this report were staggering. The Korthax had built their empire on the foundation of psychological warfare, breaking their enemies' will to fight before engaging in direct combat. Now their own soldiers were being subjected to the same tactics, but refined and perfected by a species that had spent millennia fighting itself. Marcus Hunt's latest modification to the Korthek weapons had created a chain reaction that destroyed an entire supply depot. The explosion was so massive that it could be seen from orbit, and the psychological impact on the surrounding forces was immediate and devastating. Nynya Cross had infiltrated the Korthek communication network and was broadcasting subliminal messages designed to trigger their deepest fears. The content was specifically tailored to exploit the cultural and psychological vulnerabilities that Jake Rivers had identified. Zoe Walsh had eliminated 17 key officers in the past 24 hours, each death carefully orchestrated to look like an accident or equipment malfunction. The pattern was invisible to the Korthax, but the cumulative effect was the systematic destruction of their command structure. Jake Rivers had planted false intelligence that suggested the humans were planning to use the Korthak's own weapons against their fleet in orbit. The reports were convincing enough to cause panic among the ship commanders, who began implementing defensive measures that actually made them more vulnerable to the attacks he was planning. Rex Vance watched the enemy forces begin to crumble from within and knew that the critical moment was approaching. The Korthax were starting to understand that they were facing something they had never encountered before, but they didn't know how to respond to an enemy that refused to fight by their rules. War Master Grok stood alone on his command deck, watching his forces dissolve into chaos. For the first time in his career, he was beginning to understand what his victims had felt when faced with the overwhelming power of the Korthak Empire. The humans had turned his own psychological warfare tactics against him, and his soldiers were experiencing the same terror that had broken 47 other civilizations. His communication officer approached with obvious reluctance. "Sir, we're receiving a message on your personal frequency. It appears to be from the human forces." Grok's enhanced eyes focused on the display. The message was simple and direct. "We're coming for you. The hunt begins now." For the first time in his career, War Master Grok felt something he had never experienced before. He was no longer the predator. He had become the prey, and the most dangerous humans on Earth were hunting him with the patience and precision of apex predators who had finally found worthy opponents. The siege of Velaris had become something entirely different. It was no longer a military operation. It had become a lesson in what happened when the galaxy's most ruthless conquerors faced the species that had turned warfare into an art form. The siege of Velaris had become a nightmare that War Master Grok could never have imagined. His once mighty fleet hung in orbit like a wounded beast, its crews paralyzed by reports from the planet's surface that defied everything they understood about warfare. The ground forces that had conquered 47 worlds were now little more than scattered groups of terrified soldiers hiding in whatever shelter they could find. Admiral Korth, commander of the orbital fleet, stood on the bridge of his flagship as damage reports streamed in from across the formation. Ships were experiencing cascading system failures that seemed to spread from vessel to vessel like a plague. Weapons malfunctioned at critical moments. Communication arrays failed during important operations, and the crews were reporting incidents that bordered on the supernatural. "Sir," his tactical officer reported, "the human infiltration of our systems is more extensive than we initially believed. They've managed to compromise our weapon control networks, and 3 capital ships have experienced catastrophic explosions that appear to have been caused by our own ammunition." Korth's reptilian features twisted with frustration as he studied the tactical displays. The humans had somehow turned the Korthek's own weapons against them, causing internal explosions that were far more devastating than any external attack could have been. The psychological impact on his crews was even worse than the physical damage on the planet's surface. Marcus Hunt put the finishing touches on his masterpiece. He had spent days studying the Korthek fleet's ammunition storage systems, and his modifications would create a chain reaction that would destroy multiple ships simultaneously. The beauty of his plan was that it would look like a series of accidents rather than a coordinated attack. He activated the timer and moved to his next target. The Kortheks had made their weapons so powerful that they had become vulnerabilities, waiting to be exploited. Marcus was teaching them that in warfare, sometimes the most dangerous enemy was your own arsenal. Nina Cross emerged from the tunnel system near the Korthek command center, her survival instincts having guided her through miles of debris and collapsed infrastructure. Her mission was to deliver a psychological weapon that would complete the destruction of enemy morale. She carried with her a device that would broadcast human laughter through the Korthek communication network. The sound of human laughter had been carefully chosen for its psychological impact. To the Kortheks, who had never encountered a species that could find humor in desperate situations, the sound would be more terrifying than any weapon. It would represent everything they didn't understand about humanity's capacity for finding strength and hopelessness. Zoe Walsh moved through the enemy lines with the patience of a predator who knew that her prey was already trapped. Her hunting instincts had identified the key targets whose elimination would cause the maximum psychological damage to the surviving forces. She was no longer killing individual soldiers. She was systematically destroying the Korthek's belief in their own invincibility. Her latest target was a group of officers who had been trying to coordinate a final assault on the Central Archive. She had been tracking them for hours, learning their patterns and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When she finally acted, it would look like they had been killed by their own equipment, adding to the growing paranoia that was consuming the enemy forces. Jake Rivers sat in the abandoned communication center, his fingers dancing across the alien controls as he prepared to deliver the final blow to the Korthek command structure. He had identified the psychological breaking point for each key officer, and he was ready to push them past their limits with carefully crafted messages that would exploit their deepest fears. His understanding of alien psychology had revealed that the Korthek's greatest fear was not death, but the possibility that their empire might be vulnerable to the same tactics they had used against others. He was about to make that fear a reality by showing them exactly how their own methods could be turned against them. Rex Vance stood in the Central Archive, surrounded by the collected knowledge of 1,000,000 years of galactic civilization. His role as coordinator had evolved into something more profound. He had become the orchestrator of a symphony of psychological warfare that was teaching the galaxy's most ruthless conquerors what it meant to be truly afraid. He activated his communication device and sent a message that would be broadcast simultaneously to every Korthek unit on the planet and in orbit. The message was simple but devastating. You came here to destroy the memory of the galaxy. Instead, you've become a memory yourselves. The hunt is over. War Master Grok received the message in his command center, where the few remaining loyal officers watched their commander with growing concern. The psychological pressure of the past days had aged him visibly, and his enhanced cybernetics seemed to be malfunctioning under the stress of constant paranoia. "Sir," Sub-Commander Threx reported, We're receiving surrender requests from 17 different units. The field commanders are reporting that their soldiers are no longer responding to orders. They're abandoning their positions and retreating toward the evacuation zones. Grok's mechanical hand closed around the communication device, crushing it as he processed the magnitude of his defeat. His forces still outnumbered the enemy by millions to one, but numbers meant nothing when his soldiers were more afraid of their own equipment than they were of the enemy. The sound of human laughter began echoing through the communication system, and Grok realized that the humans had found a way to turn his own psychological warfare network against him. The laughter was not mocking or cruel. It was the sound of beings who had found genuine amusement in an impossible situation, and that was somehow more terrifying than any threat could have been. Marcus Hunt's final modification triggered a chain reaction that destroyed 6 capital ships simultaneously. The explosions were visible from the planet's surface, and the psychological impact on the remaining fleet was immediate and devastating. The crews began to understand that their own weapons had become their greatest enemies. Nina Cross activated her device, and the sound of human laughter filled every communication channel in the Korthic network. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Soldiers who had never shown fear began to panic, officers abandoned their posts, and the entire command structure began to collapse under the weight of psychological pressure they had never experienced before. Zoe Walsh eliminated her final targets with surgical precision, completing the destruction of the Korthic command structure. Her hunting instincts told her that the prey was finally broken, and the systematic nature of her kills had convinced the surviving officers that they were facing something beyond their understanding. Jake Rivers delivered his final psychological blow by broadcasting a message that seemed to come from the Korthak High Command itself. The message ordered a complete withdrawal from Velarus, citing unacceptable losses to unknown enemy capabilities. The message was convincing enough to trigger a fleet-wide retreat that the real command structure was powerless to stop. Admiral Korth watched his fleet begin to dissolve as individual ships broke formation and fled toward the outer system. The psychological pressure had become unbearable, and his crews were no longer capable of functioning as a military unit. He had 2 choices: order a retreat or watch his forces destroy themselves. Rex Vance's voice crackled through the communication system one final time. War Master Grok, you have 1 hour to begin evacuation of all Korthak forces from this system. Any ship that remains after that deadline will be considered a legitimate target for human psychological warfare specialists. War Master Grok stood alone in his command center, watching his forces flee from an enemy they had never been able to see or understand. For the first time in his career, he understood what his victims had felt when faced with the overwhelming power of the Korthic Empire. The humans had turned his own methods against him, and the result was more devastating than any conventional military defeat. He activated his communication system and broadcast the order that would end his career. All Korthik forces are to evacuate the Velarus system immediately. Operation is terminated due to unacceptable casualties from unknown enemy capabilities. As the Korthik fleet began its retreat, Ambassador Thren stood in the ruins of his capital city, watching 5 humans prepare to leave as casually as they had arrived. The most dangerous humans on Earth had saved his species and the Central Archive, but they had done it in a way that would be remembered throughout the galaxy for generations to come. How did you do it? Thren asked Rex Vance as the human team prepared to board their transport. How did 5 individuals defeat an empire that had conquered 47 worlds? Rex Vance looked at the retreating Korthik fleet and smiled. Ambassador, your people and the other species in the galaxy fight wars to achieve objectives. You follow rules, you minimize casualties, you try to preserve infrastructure. The Korthaks fight wars to break their enemies' will to resist. He paused, letting the implications of his words settle. But humans don't fight wars to win objectives or break enemy morale. We fight wars to solve problems. The Korthaks were a problem, so we solved them. Captain Torres arrived to debrief the team as they prepared to leave Velarus. She had monitored the mission from orbit, watching 5 humans accomplish what entire galactic armadas had failed to do. Her report would become classified reading for every military leader in the galaxy. "How do you feel about the mission?" she asked as they boarded the transport. Marcus Hunt checked his equipment one final time, already thinking about the next challenge. It was educational. The Korthax had impressive technology, but they were predictable in how they used it. Nina cross-reviewed the environmental data she had collected during the mission. Their psychological warfare was effective against civilized species, but they had never faced opponents who enjoyed being afraid. Zoe Walsh cleaned her weapons with the same methodical precision she had used to eliminate her targets. They were efficient hunters, but they had never been hunted by something that understood them better than they understood themselves. Jake Rivers compiled his psychological analysis of the Korthak command structure. They were masters of intimidation, but they had never faced opponents who could turn their own tactics against them. Rex Vance looked out at the retreating Korthak fleet and smiled. "We showed them what it means to fight humans. Not human armies or human technology, but human nature itself." As the transport lifted off from Velaris, the 5 most dangerous humans on Earth returned to their quiet lives, leaving behind a galaxy that would never again underestimate the species that had learned to live with itself. The Korthak Empire began to crumble as word spread of their defeat, and the balance of power in the galaxy shifted forever. War Master Grok's final report to the Korthak High Command was simple and devastating. "We encountered humans. Retreat is the only option. They fight like no other species in the galaxy. They are not conquerors or defenders. They are problem solvers, and they consider everything else to be problems waiting to be solved." The galaxy had learned a valuable lesson about what happened when civilizations cried for help. Earth would always answer, but the response would be exactly what humanity was, the most dangerous species in the universe, perfectly willing to solve any problem that threatened those who couldn't solve it themselves.